begin with our first panel discussion was Asceticism before Christianity. First, I have the pleasure to welcome our first speaker, David Preston, who just came here through the Parisian traffic. David Preston is a lecturer in philosophy at Royal Holloway University of London. His primary research interests in ancient philosophy, and especially within intertext with ancient comedy. So I now pass the floor to David Preston.
Thank you. Bon matin, mes amis. Can I just say thank you to Manoir for inviting me to this conference. It's so nice to be in Paris and so nice to have both Royal Holloway and the École coming together. So honestly, I'm not quite sure how I've pitched this. I'm afraid it might be a little bit descriptive, as I was sort of hoping that a lot of you wouldn't really know a lot about ancient philosophy, because I assume you all have lives and friends and, aren't as sad as me. But what I'm going to do in this paper is outline just a few of the motivations for asceticism in ancient philosophy. I've got quite a snappy title. You'll see the paper probably won't live up to the excitement of it, but nonetheless, now how do I go through here? Can I make this full screen? To a slideshow. Current slide. Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do is, once again, outline the variety of motivations for practicing an ascetic lifestyle in Greek philosophy, because you'll see that there are quite a variety of different reasons, and certainly some more sane and reasonable than the others. So to kick off, we'll look at Empedocles and the Pythagoreans, and we'll see that these maintain a restrictive diet, which is motivated by their belief in metempsychosis and the fear that consuming certain foods might be tantamount to cannibalism. So watch this space. Then we move on to Plato and perhaps Socrates. We'll see that his motivations for the ascetic lifestyle are a lot more nuanced, and it relates back to his theory, the tripartite soul, and privileging rationality over desire and the appetitive parts of the soul. We'll then look at the Cynics, who live a life of extreme simplicity owing to their belief that personal happiness is satisfied by meeting one's natural needs, and what is natural cannot be shameful. So we'll talk about Diogenes the Cynic. So if you haven't heard of him, you will, and it'll change your life. And we look at certain Stoics. John touched a little bit on this yesterday, so I'll sort of skim over them. But the essential tenet here is that luxurious living corrupts people, and so must be completely avoided. And that corrosive desires mean we can never satisfy them, they must be avoided, etc., etc. And if we have time, we'll look at Epicure. So while not quite an ascetic, his philosophy has some elements of asceticism, and he certainly gives you some comfort if your economic situation only allows you to live an ascetic lifestyle. So it's sort of, well, if you live in poverty, here's how you can be happy with it. But to kick off, let's look at Pythagoras. Now, as you probably know, nothing actually survives in the hand of Pythagoras or indeed his followers. This is because they're a very insular group. They're like a sect. Much of what we can determine about them comes from observers writing about them or speculation on the acousmata. These are the sort of oral maxims that were handed down among the Pythagoreans. Nonetheless, numerous sources attest that to master self-control, initiates were required to take a 5-year vow of silence, to undergo extended vows of fasting, and a restricted diet was expected of all members of the school, for the want of a better word. So this is a quote I have here from Porphyry. And again, we must note here that Porphyry is writing centuries later on here. So we must take what he says with a bit of salt. But he says, what he told his audience cannot be said with certainty, he being Pythagoras here, for he enjoined silence upon his hearers. But the following is a matter of general information. So Porphyry here is telling us that we don't know much, but this seems to be the case. He taught that the soul was immortal, and after death, it transmigrated into other bodies. Now, this is interesting, as this idea of metempsychosis and the immortality of the soul underpins quite a few motivations for asceticism in Greek philosophy, and it animates into other bodies. After certain specified periods, the events will never occur again. Nothing was entirely new, and that all animated beings were kin and should be considered as belonging to the one great family. Pythagoras was the first to introduce these teachings into Greece. Now, for the sake of brevity here, I'm only going to deal with the primary fragments because, as you can imagine, the secondary scholarship and everything I'm going to show you here is absolutely legion. We'd be here all day and you would hate me. So I'm not going to make you suffer through that. I'll make this as quick and painless as possible. But from this, we can determine 3 points on Pythagoras. So the first being, it's impossible to determine with any certainty which Pythagorean practices or tenets can be traced back to the man himself. 2, students were forbidden to divulge the secrets of the group to the initiated, kind of like a cult. And see, after death, the soul transmigrates into animal bodies. Accordingly, animals should therefore be treated with the same respect and dignity we afford our fellow humans. Now, these are points that it's interesting that scholars in antiquity could only really agree on this, and scholars in modernity can only really still agree on this. Since it's the morning, would you like to hear a joke from ancient comedy? Yes, it's not very funny. So we'll see the Pythagoreans avoided eating meat and certain other foods because they believed that the soul of the human migrated to animal bodies after death. So just as you wouldn't eat human flesh because it contained what was once human, you shouldn't eat meat because it also contained what was once human, this being the soul. So Alexis, fragment 147. Did you hear about the Pythagorean who returned from market and said he was going to follow the Pythagorean way of life and avoid from eating anything that had a soul? And his friend said to him, but you've got a side of lamb, you've got some mutton, and you've got some fish. And he said, yes, but they're dead, so they don't have a soul anymore. And that's how the Greeks got their kicks. So, yeah, where would we be without Stephen Fry? Now, what concluding marks do I have on these? I'm rushed through these. But implicit in the Pythagorean tenet, and something we'll see in Empedocles, is that eating meat is tantamount to cannibalism. Meat is murder, pretty much. He'd have been big fans of Morrissey, if anybody knows him. No, but this is Empedocles of Acrogas. Now, we're actually fortunate to have quite a lot of in Empedocles' own hand. To the best of my knowledge, I think he's the fragments of his are the most extant of the Greek philosopher, or the pre-Socratics rather. They found a new passage of him too, which is very exciting. Yes, but to his contemporaries, which is quite interesting with Empedocles, is he's seen as more of sort of a wonder worker or a magician or than a philosopher. Sort of he's seen as more of a mystic. And we have all of these fantastical stories of his life about him bringing people back from the dead, and with death is probably the best known fact about him. He jumped into a volcano. He jumped into Mount Etna to prove his divinity. Don't know how, it didn't work out very well for him. We haven't seen him since anyway. So, but apart from these, crazy, fantastical stories aside, we can also credit him as being the first to posit the idea of an element, the first to offer a plausible pluralistic response to Parmenides' monism. But perhaps owing to the Pythagorean influence in southern Italy, where he was from, or Sicily rather, where he was from, his metaphysical system is heavily influenced and indeed dependent on the doctrine of metempsychosis. This again being the transmigration of the soul into other animal bodies. Now, again, as we have something in Empedocles' own hand, he gives us a much more unclouded version than we get with the Pythagoreans. With the Pythagoreans, it's more people sitting outside going, who are those weirdos? I heard they don't eat meat. What? They won't talk to us. Empedocles is sort of saying, yes, this is in my own hand. And he comes across a bit crazy, but if you haven't heard of Empedocles, buckle up. This is the first. So he says, it is an oracle of necessity, an ancient decree of the gods, eternal and securely sealed with broad oaths, that when one goes astray and pollutes his body with murder, one of the spirits to whom long life has been allotted, for 30,000 seasons he wanders far from the blessed ones. In time he assumes all the various forms of mortal things and exchanges one hard path of life for another. Now I too am one of these, an exile from the gods, a wanderer putting trust in the insanities of strife. So Empedocles, it seems, is telling us, has been damned to millennia of reincarnations. Now, his crime to merit this punishment was murder committed in one of his previous existence. His evidence for this, you might be interested in asking, why do you think this, Empedocles? Well, of course, it's his memory. He says, for in the past, I've already been a boy, a girl, a shrub, a bird, and the fish that leaps from the sea as it travels. Now, there is some vagueness as to whether Empedocles alone must suffer this fate, or if this is something all of us, or at least most of us, must endure. Now, moreover, there seems to be some ambiguity over the cause of the soul's pollution. Was it the murder of a human, a sort of standard argument in a murder, or was it an animal through eating meat? Empedocles actually clarifies both questions in perhaps the most visceral of his fragments. He says, will you not see the terrible sounds of your murder? Do you not see that in your thoughtlessness you are eating one another? A father raises up his own son in a different form and slaughters him with a prayer, the utter fool. Assumingly talking about sacrificial animals here, which is interesting in itself because Pythagoras seemed to have accepted sacrificial animals. Empedocles doesn't. While the son sheds bitter tears and begs for mercy from the sacrificer, and likewise a father takes a son takes his father, children their mother, deprive them of life and consume their own flesh. So for Empedocles, then, all killing, again, is murder. The fact that the victim is an animal is no mitigation. It should not be treated any differently as to when a human was killed. This killing is, again, presupposed by his belief in metempsychosis. The soul of the animal may once have been the soul of a human and therefore should be treated accordingly. Now, there's also a myriad of suggestions as to why Pythagoras memorably urged his followers to avoid all beans. Beans, I mean, not beings, beans. There's one of the anecdotes about how he died was he was being chased because he was Pythagoras, and he came to a field of beans and wouldn't cross the bean field, and his pursuers captured him and killed him. Now, obviously, this story is a bit Scooby-Doobious, but this is attests to his feelings about beans. But interestingly enough, Empedocles talks about being reincarnated not only as an animal or a human, but also a shrub, which shows that, for Empedocles at least, your soul won't just reincarnate as a human form or an animal form, but certainly in certain forms of inorganic material. He says here that he was a shrub in the past. That must have been fun, just shrubbing about. But this makes it interesting because to his quote where, and the title of this paper, he says, "Wretches, utter wretches, keep your hands off beans." So this would suggest that the diet was restricted not only from meat, but also certain types of vegetables and grains, as they too might have had the capacity to have held the soul of that which was once human, as Empedocles himself attests to when he claims he was a shrub. What's interesting here is Empedocles views the consumption of meat, the fact that we're all eating meat and certain other foods, as the cause of all human suffering and clamor. And to purify ourselves, we must avoid these indulgences and keep a very restricted diet. I must say here too, for the purpose of this paper, I'm defining asceticism quite broadly, just as avoiding indulgences wherever possible. Yes. Let's move on to Plato. That's Plato there. Isn't he great? Now, Plato's interesting because he's got quite a few reasons for promoting an ascetic lifestyle. From a political perspective, Socrates states in the Republic that its inhabitants will have little in terms of needs. They'll keep a very restricted ascetic diet. I should also say that for the purpose of this paper, I will willingly and nonchalantly conflate Plato and Socrates. But in the Republic, he says, well, when we're building our ideal state, we'll have a very simple ascetic life. The reason for this is that such a life is easy to sustain and provide for. If we want luxuries, well, then we're going to need the resources to produce the luxuries, which means we'll need more land, which means we need to invade our neighbor. So to avoid all of this extra clamor, we'll keep a simplistic lifestyle. He also says that the rulers, the philosopher kings and queens in the Republic, will live a very simplistic lifestyle. They live in huts and keep a very simplistic diet. He also says somewhere that if somebody threatens to invade them, they'll just give them all of their goods, all their material goods, because they don't care for it. But this links into his metaphysical motive. The philosopher king will not care for materialism and will be happy with an ascetic lifestyle because the appetitive part of their soul will be kept in check. Now, this is grounded in his theory of the tripartite soul, in which the soul consists of three parts: the rational part, the appetitive part, and the emotional part. Now, the bipartite soul, consisting only of the emotional and the appetitive elements, is that of the animal. So Plato and Aristotle too, I think, agree that it's this rational element that separates us from the animals. So to live the best life, to be winning, if, as the kids would say, one must be privileging the rational part of the soul. And the appetitive part of the soul should not be given priority over reason at any doubt or at any stage. It should be constrained and be the most subservient of the three. Indeed, this is what Plato says in the Republic. If you haven't read it, I'll save you time. The just soul is one in which the rational faculty is governing the emotional and the appetitive faculty. So by giving in to indulgence and by rejecting asceticism, you're privileging the appetitive part of your soul, and you're living the life of the animal rather than the life of the human. Thus, Plato says, philosophers should oppose the body in every respect and avoid pleasures, desires, pains, and fears to whatever extent is possible. He says here, our human body acts as a temporary prison for our soul, with its wants and desires, leading us to misplace value and goodness in objects that can satisfy them. So, money, status, power, sex, etc., etc. And this causes us to turn away from what Plato deems to be the pursuit of true knowledge. He says, in truth or in fact, no thought of any kind ever comes to us from the body. Only the body and its desires cause war, civil discords, and battles. If we are ever to have pure knowledge, we must escape from the body and observe things themselves with the soul by itself. Going back to your paper yesterday, John, this is very spiritual, if you ask me. But we can see here that Plato was urging us to reject any form of privileging the appetitive part of our nature. We must reject or suppress this at least as much as possible and privilege only our rational faculty. The soul of the non-philosopher, for Plato, always couples with the body, loves and serves it, and is bewitched by it, by its desires and pleasures. So the non-philosopher leads the non-ascetic life. The philosopher for Plato must lead an ascetic life. The hoi polloi, or hoi polloi as Plato calls them, live the non-ascetic life. The lovers of learning, philosophers, he says, recognize that when philosophy takes control of their soul, it has been really bound in the body and glued to it. It is forced to examine the things that are through this as if though a prison, rather than through itself. And it swallows in utter ignorance, or it wallows in utter ignorance, rather. And philosophy discerns the cunning of the prison that imprisons through desire. And so the prisoner himself may most of all be an accomplice in this imprisonment. Now, one thing I should note here is that the extent of Plato's asceticism is debatable, and it comes similar enough to what John says yesterday, because there's a lot of good stuff in Plato, but a lot of sort of nutty stuff. So a lot of, especially modern scholars, indeed people that John and I know, will say he's not really preaching full-blown asceticism. He's just preaching moderation. It's like, your doctor will say, look, you shouldn't drink, alcohol is bad, but of course you can have, a glass of champagne at your PhD viva or whatever. It's fine, but just don't do it all the time, every time. Tobacco is bad, but, have a cigar when your child is born. That's fine. And so it's just moderation rather than asceticism. But Plato does seem to think here that these objects that can privilege our desire at least have the potential to be bad and ruinous, and the philosopher will be careful and avoid taking the risk. But what is more interesting too is testimony from ancient comedy, who seem to think that Plato was quite an ascetic. This is a quote from Aristophane called Plato. And he says, Plato saying to a student, in 3 days, I'll render him skinnier than Philippides. This is somebody known to be very sort of gaunt and ghost-like. And a student says, you can make corpses in so few days. This is from Aristophanes' Clouds. Now, this is Socrates being parodied here. I know, but I'm not going to get into that debate because we'd be here all night. But this is Strepsiades and his son Phidippides outside Socrates' institution looking at the students. And he says, who are these people? And he says, I'm not sure I know their names, but they are all gentlemen, good or true, and fine philosophers of the sort. And Phidippides says, oh, I know who you mean, that God-forsaken bunch of pasty-looking frauds going around barefoot. You're talking about Socrates and Chaerephon. And later, Strepsiades meets some of the students, and he says, by heavens, what on earth are those creatures? And he says, there are students. What do you think they are? And he says, they look like a bunch of half-starving, walking wounded. So at least, there is testimony from antiquity here that Plato wasn't so much moderation as sort of get in the back room and starve. How are we doing for time, Manuel?
It's mostly the time.
Okay.
In 5 minutes. 5 minutes,
okay. Let's have a look at the cynics. Should be able to get through these. So, yes, perhaps the most memorable of the ascetics is Diogenes' Sinope. He's expelled from his native Turkey for forging currency. He gave away all his possessions in Athens, and upon moving to Athens and took up residency, perhaps most famously in a wine barrel. He's surrounded by dogs here because the cynic comes from, as you know, the Greek from kunos, which means dog. So he was Diogenes the dog. This is a quote from Diogenes Laertius about him. He said, he was not seeking any of the things which are considered to be dainties. So he discovered the means of adapting himself to circumstances. He was the first, say some, to fold his cloak because he was obliged to sleep in it as well. And he carried a wallet to hold his victuals. And he used any place for any purpose, for breakfasting, for sleeping, or conversing. And then he would say, pointing to the portico of Zeus and the hall of the processions, that the Athenians had provided him with a place to live in. There's a good story where he discards his only remaining possession, which was a water bowl, upon seeing a peasant girl scooping up water. And he says, child has beaten me in penniless living. But his extreme asceticism, rather, is not just attention seeking. It's actually grounded in quite sane reasoning. And this is his antiphonian belief that nature should supersede convention. So conventional living, with all of its, luxuries and conveniences, has made us soft and corrupted, and that we must strive to live according to nature, a life devoid of the luxuries of conventional living. So what have I done? He would often insist loudly that the gods have given him the means of living easily, but this had been put out of sight because we require honeycakes, ointments, and the like. And this is something we'll see kind of through the Cynics, but also in the Epicureans, that to live according to our needs, to our nature, is easy. To get to satisfy your needs. When we live according to our wants, that's when it gets tricky, because you become obsessed with satisfying wants, and these wants can never be fully satisfied. You satisfy it, another desire arises. It's sort of like whack-a-mole. He says nothing in life has any chance of succeeding without strenuous practice, and this is capable of overcoming anything. Accordingly, instead of useless toils, men should choose such as nature recommends, whereby they might have lived happily. Yet such is their madness that they choose to be miserable. For even the despising of pleasure itself is most pleasurable when we are habituated to it. And just as those accustomed to a life of pleasure feel disgust when they pass over to the opposite experience, so those whose training has been of the opposite kind derive more pleasure from despising pleasure than from the pleasures themselves. This was the gist of his conversation, and it was plain that he acted accordingly, adulterating currency in very truth, allowing convention no such authority as he allowed natural right, asserting that the manner of life he lived was the same as Heracles when he preferred liberty to anything. So the natural life, again, for Diogenes, is the easiest to fulfill and sustain. The conventional life, with its predilection towards materialism and luxury, is one of inevitable disappointment and frustration, stemming from consistently wanting and failing to satisfy these events. You think, okay, well, I want this promotion. I work very hard. I get the promotion. I get the raise. And then you think, I'm happy now for a few minutes. And then I become dissatisfied. And then I start working again. And then I seek to satisfy this. And then I'm momentarily happy. And then another desire arises. And then you might have time to do some gardening, and then you die. And this is how you've lived your life, one of striving and unhappiness. Where for living according to nature for Diogenes is, I have very simple needs that are very easily satisfied. This is easy to sustain, and it does not bring me any pain or misery when I fail to succeed it. Yeah, I have some stuff on the Stoics and the Epicureans, but I'm aware that we're probably out of time, so I'll stop here. So thank you for listening. Yes.
Thank you, David. So we're now 2 minutes through. I would like to welcome Michael Chase, researcher at CNRS, Jean Pétan. His work focuses on the history of ancient philosophy, and he has translated and commented on Porphyry and Simplicius. He's also the English translator of of whom he was a close friend and collaborator. So now I would like to switch to PowerPoint.
Meanwhile, it gives me the chance to thank very sincerely the organizers, especially Manoir, for successfully carrying out this titanic accomplishment, and it's organizing a lovely conference from which I've learned a great deal. So, how is that showing up? Okay. Yeah, so my talk is going to be basically about was inspired by the fact that when ancient scholars are writing about the relationships between Christianity and paganism, non-Christian philosophy, sometimes they claim that what is particularly characteristic of Christian philosophy, as embodied in the tradition of the Desert Fathers, beginning with the 4th century of our period, the hermits who retired to the desert, is that the Desert Fathers were obsessed with demons. Everything they were doing was intended to scare away demons. And this is supposed to be characteristic of Christianity. And what I want to argue is that not so much, because we find this very similar obsession with demons in some of the late pagan beliefs of the 3rd and 4th century. So, let's move on.
I get the motion, I get the raise, and then you think I'm happy now for a few minutes, and then satisfied, and then I start working again, and then satisfied, then I'm momentarily happy, and then the desire arises. My practice is so guarding and God, and this is how you life.
Okay, then, great. So, Porphyry in his different works gives very different classifications of the demons. They can all be good to us or bad to us. They do us favors when we worship them correctly. They can get angry with us and do us bad things to us when we don't recognize them and provide them the worship they want. Now, Porphyry divides demons basically into two classes. One class is good. They're the souls who are born from the universal soul. They administer the large portions of the world, and they rely on their pneuma, and we'll talk more about exactly what the pneuma is, but they're able to control it. And that's what makes them dominated in accordance with reason, and that's what makes them good. In contrast, the evil demons are controlled by their pneuma, and that makes them subject to fits of anger and rage, and it makes them kakoergoi, or sometimes he calls them poneroi, evil demons. And like the good demons, like all demons, they are normally invisible. They have no particular body of their own, but they can adopt all different kinds of shapes and figures. And we'll look briefly into exactly how they do that. All right, great. Yeah, so as far as the evil demons are concerned, they rejoice in all that is discordant and incoherent. They dwell close to the earth, and they dedicate themselves to doing bad things to human beings. They're the cause of natural disasters, plagues, famines, earthquakes, and so forth, and to which they persuade people to blame the gods for. And in general, they have the agenda of doing bad things, committing injustice without getting caught. They also have a leader, according to Porphyry. He doesn't really tell us much about exactly who that leader is, but that leader's desire is to convert everyone to his worship. As far as the effects on human psychology is concerned, they have a direct effect on the human imagination. They're also responsible for all black magic, for preparation of erotic charms. They are responsible for intemperance, akolosia, hopes of wealth and glory, but above all for deceit, apate, which is natural to them. Now, the way they exercise their influence on humans includes the fact that they adopt the appearance of God. They win over the affection of the multitudes by inflaming their desires by means of love and yearning for wealth, power, and pleasure, and also, interestingly, by vain opinions, kenodoxiae, which they instill in human beings. This is an interesting term. It has, in Epicurean philosophy, it just means sort of an empty opinion not based on anything. But in the Christian tradition, beginning with Evagrius of Pontus, the sort of the founding father of the Desert Fathers, it becomes a very crucial